Some really curious things I started noticing with that was that it was as if particular postures were associated with particular emotions, right? I started really paying attention to you know, why is it that when I pull my shoulder out, I feel certain emotions, right? Why is it that I had an intense day of anger after doing this? Because it seemed very arbitrary at first, and I was just kind of chalking it up to I don't know, whatever. There's no real reason. It's just stuff. But I started having these experiences where I would do particular motions or postures, and if I really paid attention to the emotions that were coming up, it was very closely associated with those motions as they would have happened as a kid when I first injured that area. And so, for example, the first time I noticed this was I was kind of having some I guess rotator cuff stuff. Like that's what a lot of this is revolved around. And I noticed that if I was at the dog park throwing a ball with my dog, and I noticed that I was doing this kind of baseball throw thing, and it was like flashing me back to my baseball days, right? And I thought, okay, that's interesting, but it seemed kind of normal. But then later that day, as I was massaging this stuff, I kept having these really intense flashbacks back to that. And then I worked on it in therapy, and it was like really, really intense, like flashing back to some kind of traumatic stuff from that time, and it was associated with this motion, right? And the more I paid attention to that, the more I realized this is really a thing. Particular postures are doing certain things.
So the memories are getting built into certain muscle patterns so that when that muscle pattern is
Yeah, it
re-engaged,
seems that way.
then that memory comes up.
Well, quite literally that way.
Yeah.
It seems
Yeah.
to be, yeah. Traditional medicine probably would not want to go that far and say that because, I think the perspective of traditional medicine would be like, well, I mean, when you release emotional or when you release physical pain, you feel better, and so that's going to just naturally make your emotions generally better. Like they would see it in a very general way,
Mm-hmm.
in a very kind of incidental relationship, but not a literal one-to-one causal relationship, right? But what I want to argue for and maybe give some examples for is I think there is a real, literal, very one-to-one causal relationship because of what you just described. It was like it finally connected the cognitive with the emotional for me, like in a really deep way, because I realized, oh, I have these moods that have become localized to certain parts of the network, and I can activate that by, by my posture. And so I can activate the little segment of the mind that has all the fear, and then I can move into the other part of the mind that has some of the more kind of rah, like life, that doesn't have the fear, right? And it was like this massive light bulb for me where I suddenly realized oh, both of those are me. They're just parts of me that are not talking to each other, right? And suddenly I was then able to rapidly transition between the different moods. Once they're touching, they can share information.
The connection that you've discovered between the physical posture or stress or tension or movement and the memories. So now you have two sets of two parts of your bodies talking to each other. You have the two sets of memories that can now talk to each other, but then you also have the memories stored in the muscles that can talk to the cognitive side and the emotional side. So it's like you're rewiring the whole setup, right?
Absolutely. And I also noticed that I was feeling a lot more optimism and just kind of goofy, boyish, sort of just bleh, not as much of the stoic, old, grumpy, crusty man, but I started feeling the way I did when I was a little kid again. And I was like, what's going on there? And my theory about that is let's say as a kid, you're loose, your body's loose, you just bleh all the time, Well, let's say for whatever reason, let's say you're in a family where you're shamed for expression or whatever. You just don't feel safe expressing. Well, you're gonna go from I'm happy to oh, shame, 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 shame. And you're gonna start being less expressive, right? And so now you're not going into those states that you were previously associating with joy. You're just not doing that. You're not going into those postures and those movements. You're not activating those parts of your body, right? And so it's almost like you start getting this tunnel vision. right? And the more time this goes on, the more you're kind of compressed down to this one state that's not very expressive, right? And
Mhm.
now your range of motion is very limited. Your physical range of motion is very limited, but the range of motion of your emotional moods is also becoming limited, right? You're getting this tunnel vision where now this very narrow aspect of my being is all that I'm able to see, right? Because I'm no longer going into the joyful, I'm not activating that stuff anymore. I'm just activating sitting in a chair and thinking and moving the mouse. You need deep body work alongside deep emotional work. Philosophically, for many generations now, we've bought into this idea that, oh yeah, my mind is in control. My cognition is in control of everything. So I just get my cognitions right, everything will work out. And it's like it's just not true. It's like this willingness to become incarnate and live among my physical embodied cognition. My cognition has to become embodied. It has to become incarnate. It has to deal with all this and be willing to die to itself, be willing to be torn apart, to be torn asunder, which leads to a death that is resurrection. And they are the death and the resurrection are the same experience, you know, in some manner. And that leads to healing and unity, and now heaven and earth are connected eternally. It's like it just makes a lot of sense to me at this point.